dour, unpleasant, rigid, and perhaps most important of all, thoroughly evil. The duergar are the bad-tempered and malicious counterparts of their more noble-minded cousins, the Shield and Gold Dwarves. Like many creatures of the Underdark, the duergar have been shaped by the harsh underground environment. Like all peoples, they too have a history, albeit a different one to that of the drow, a history of how they descended into the Underdark, leading to a very different type of dwarf. The history of the duergar begins over 9,000 years ago, as a clan of shield dwarves in an ancient dwarven realm called Shanatar. Unlike many other dwarves who worship the more traditional dwarven pantheon, such as Moradin and Clangeddin Silverbeard, this clan venerated Ladoguer above the others, a harsher, more demanding deity, and the clan had greater ambitions than most others, going so far as to break away from the other dwarven clans at the time to live on their own separately. And they were able to live and work in isolation, away from the rest of dwarven society, and for a while, the Duergar clan was able to pursue its own plans and goals separately from mainstream dwarven civilization, but this isolation also made them more vulnerable, as in their isolation, Clan Duergar was attacked and overwhelmed by Illithids, who either killed them or enslaved them, dragging them off to the darker depths of the Underdark. The Duergar were held as slaves and prisoners of the Mind Flayers for many generations, and subjected to painful, cruel, and unusual experiments, fundamentally altering their physiology. Already long skeptical of the traditional dwarven pantheon, and seeing their long-standing captivity under the Mind Flayers as evidence that Moradin and the other gods had long ago forsaken them, many Duergar turned to devil worship and collusion with devils. Although finally, in conjunction with this and other factors, they were able to successfully rebel against their Illithid masters and strike out on their own. However, the many generations of experiments performed upon them, as well as their infernal dealings, left an indelible mark on the Duergar, and they journeyed further into the Underdark, more different than ever before, from their Shield and Gold Dwarf cousins. What's more, the long years of captivity led to resentment and hatred, and it would never again be possible to reconcile the dwarven groups, in much the same way that drow, collectively speaking, could never reconcile with the surface elves that banished them long ago. Scarred but strengthened by the trials forced upon them under Mind Flayer domination, the Duergar struck out on their own and created their own version of dwarven society in the Underdark, but one that is fundamentally different from any among their dwarven cousins. In many ways, Duergar society is a caricature of traditional dwarven society. There are many similarities, in that Duergar, like other dwarves, are industrious, persistent, and orderly. But unlike other dwarves, who typically have good in their hearts, the Duergar turn much of that goodness on its head, and embody all that could go wrong in dwarven culture. Inspired by their chief god Ladoguer, Gray Dwarves are dour in the extreme, pessimistic, hateful, grim, and possessed of a bleak and fatalistic outlook on life. Wholly joyless, the only value Duergar see in life is in their commitments to their work and in their ability to exercise cruelty towards others. In their eyes, their lack of happiness and contentment is the actual proof that they are the virtuous among the dwarves. Their willingness to sacrifice any semblance of happiness for the dire vision of how they see the world fundamentally separates them from other dwarves, and is the proof of their virtue, in their eyes, over the other dwarves. Greedy, sullen, and insular, Duergar are intrinsically untrusting of outsiders, and this is something you can actually see play out in Baldur's Gate 3 with their interactions with everyone, whether Deep Gnome, the PC, Drow, or any random follower of the Absolute, as they are really only on their own side, and their xenophobia prevents them from developing any sort of lasting alliance with others, let alone friendship, which given the harsh environment of the Underdark makes perfect sense. Like many other beings of the Underdark, the Duergar are byproducts of this environment, and it has shaped them into what they are today. Of course, much of this stems from a sense of resentment cultivated over the millennia, in similar fashion to the resentment the Drow have cultivated towards the Surface Elves, and is deeply rooted in self-delusion. And in similar fashion, Duergar are masters of nursing grudges against others of their kind, other denizens of the Underdark, and above all, against other dwarves. Much of this is spurred on by the religion of the Duergar. Even millennia ago, before their enslavement at the hands of the Mind Flayers, the Duergar clan prioritized the worship of Ladoguer over that of the other dwarven gods in the pantheon. And from the very outset, Ladoguer's mentality and mindset stood in stark contrast to that of Moradin's. Thus, for example, whilst Moradin expects and encourages industry and hard work, Ladoguer is quite literally a slave driver, and does not set any limits to his expectations of his worshippers, whereas Moradin is eternally watchful of dwarves' greatest vices, pride and greed, respectively, guarding against them. Laudagor fosters such vices in the Gray Dwarves and lets them fester, believing them to be virtues, whereas Moradin teaches loyalty. Laudagor teaches obedience. Laudagor's influence can be felt throughout Grey Dwarf society, as his principles form the bedrock of duergar social structure. Laudagor's doctrine can be encapsulated rather easily. Obedience to one's leaders, enslavement and exploitation of your enemies, militarization of territory captured and conquered, and the forging of magical weapons and armor. To this end, duergar frequently engage in slave raids. Indeed, you can meet such slaves in the Underdark in BG3, and much of their economy is fueled by the slave trade. And the duergar slave trade contributes a large part to the Underdark economy. In addition to Laudagor, duergar also worship the demigoddess Deep Duera, who is generally regarded to be his daughter, and who uniquely holds the portfolio of the mental arts of psionics, skills that she stole from the Illithids many millennia ago during duergar captivity, which she has subsequently honed and spread amongst the duergar. Relations with other races, both in the Underdark and in the lands above, are rather poor, which is understandable given that paranoia and distrust are hallmarks of the duergar race. Nevertheless, even a people as paranoid and xenophobic as the duergar are do occasionally need to trade and engage with the outside world. Possibly the most frequent interaction that takes place is between duergar and drow. Sometimes they are at outright war with each other, and other times there seems to be what one might almost call a friendly alliance. Clearly, beneath the surface, neither race trusts or likes each other. Grey Dwarf relations with Deep Gnomes are especially poor, and they rarely, if ever, cooperate with each other, with Grey Dwarves usually being on the offensive, looking for slaves among them, and duergar understandably have exclusively hostile relations with Illithids, in much the same manner as the Githyanki, dating back to their enslavement and captivity under the Mind Flayers, and is often a matter of attack on sight between the two races. Perhaps most tragically, or most understandably, Grey Dwarves have an exceedingly hostile relationship with their Shield Dwarf cousins, resenting them for their perceived abandonment in their hour of need under the yoke of the Mind Flayers, and have therefore harbored a deep-seated loathing towards them, and have waged war with their Shield Dwarf cousins ever since. All of this leads us perhaps logically to the question as to whether or not duergar ever leave their Underdark homes, and the answer to that is almost never. The idea of a duergar, miles beneath the surface, striking out on his own, on a whim, is fairly absurd, since the chances of his survival would be minimal, on top of the usual grimness and xenophobia on display, which would preclude them from venturing out too much from their own communities. When duergar are found outside of their communities, it is highly probable that they are in fact exiles, no longer welcome there, and therefore forced to take up a life of quote-unquote adventuring for the sake of pure survival. On the surface, of course, they are frequently met with hostility and skepticism, above all from their dwarven cousins, which makes the thought of a free adventuring duergar all the stranger to consider. Of course, we do meet duergar in-game, and although they are not as yet available as a playable race, I think it's very likely they will be. The assets are there, and we already have drow, so why not add duergar? And I'm sure that they would make for some interesting dialogue, particularly in the Underdark, as well as with their unique powers and abilities. Think, for example, of a duergar rogue with innate invisibility. Hopefully we'll be able to play the Grey Dwarves at the very latest by the release of the full game. Until then, we'll just have to be patient. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. And I'll check you out next time. Take care.